Morning, everyone. Happy that you could join us. This is a really fun and engaging topic for us three in particular, and I know all three of us are really excited to be able to talk to you about it. I'm going to be acting as a panelist and moderator, so I'm going to work through bios for the three of us, and then we're going to get into a little bit more about us and supporting first-generation students. So our first panelist is Tanisha Campbell, and Tanisha's humble journey began at Vanier College in 2011, where she obtained a diploma in animal health technology and worked as an animal nurse for 2 to 3 years. She was offered admission in 2013 at Bishop's University, double majoring in modern languages and international Japanese studies and Hispanic studies and psychology. For the 2014-2015 term, Tanisha was the first ever Canadian to attend Tokushima University in Japan through the International Exchange Program. With this opportunity, she spearheaded an Art and Cultural Exchange ACE project and was awarded with the McDaniel Student Opportunity Fund from Bishop's University. Tanisha's photographic exhibition and culture exchange initiatives were hosted at two of Tokushima's sister cities, Liria, Portugal, and Jelgava, Latvia. The reality of being a first-generation student hit hard, and so Tanisha returned to her hometown in Montreal after the exchange due to fiscal limitations and transferred to Concordia University for the fall of 2015 and graduated in 2018 with a psychology specialization and minor in First People Studies. Fueled by intrinsic motivation to do more and to complete her original focus in modern languages, Tanisha has returned to Bishop's University and is now in the process of disseminating knowledge and advocating for equity-minded higher education through Bishop's University's Graduate Certificate in Knowledge Mobilization. So that's Tanisha. She's our first panelist. Our next up is Clancy McDaniel. So Clancy McDaniel is from Brook Village, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, a community that has more cows than it does people. That's definitely true. She has been a student advocate from a young age, first sitting on the advisory board for the Strait Regional School Board in high school, and has since held roles in St. FX's Residence Life, the St. FX Students Union, and currently as the Executive Director of Students Nova Scotia. She volunteers her time on the board of Lake City Works, Girls 20 Young Directors Program, was a delegate chosen to represent Canada in the 64th United Nations Commission of the Status of Women. Clancy is a proud university graduate, the first in her family, and credits the generations of mothers and grandmothers before her who raised their children on hard work and integrity despite living in poverty. Clancy specializes in communications, government relations, and spending too much money on Uber Eats. Yeah, mine and Clancy's favorite hobby is definitely eating food together. My name's Tiffany MacLennan. It turns out reading your bio is really, really weird, so I'm not going to do it. I'm from Cape Breton, born and raised. I'm a first-generation student from my family. I have 2 degrees from St. FX University, and I have held a multitude of roles at St. FX, from being Vice President Academics for the Students' Union to sitting on their Board of Governors, and now I am a research fellow for the Maple Leaf. So that is the three of us in a nutshell. That was a lot of talking, folks. So how we're going to work through the next 55 minutes of our lives is we're going to talk to you about some of our experiences on our campus and some of the challenges that we have faced being first-generation students on our campus. We're going to talk about some of the supports that we thought might have been great for us moving forward. And then in the second 30 minutes-ish of our scheduled time together, we're going to open it up to the floor to have a little bit more conversation-based discussion about how do we better support first-generation students on our campuses. So kind of with that preface, I'll pass it over to Clancy first to take it away. What have your experiences been, Clance? Let's hear it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you to everyone who is here. I'm seeing that we have 44 participants on the call, which is fabulous. Again, my name is Clancy, and I am also from Cape Breton. And if anybody is familiar, it's definitely very small town vibes. My background comes from being in a rural community. I came from a low-income family, and as mentioned, I was the first person in my family to both attend and graduate from university. When I started to think about, what were the paramount experiences in my undergraduate that I felt like more pertinent to being a first generation student, I actually thought first about an experience I had before I even got in university. I had been applying to as many scholarships as possible because I knew I was going to be in a financial situation where I'd likely have to work, take out student loans, and hopefully get some scholarships as well. And while at one of the scholarship interviews, I was there with probably 20 other participants from across the country. And when I was hearing about the different things they were talking about in their interviews, some students were saying, I interned at this research lab in Toronto where I was working on the cure for cancer, or I was a part of a social enterprise where we raised $5 million for XYZ cause. I was walking into the interview saying, so I competed at the 4-H county fair in public speaking, and I was in my high school drama club, and we created a gay-straight alliance in a town where a lot of folks had very conservative views. And it became very apparent to me that as a first-generation student, particularly from my socioeconomic status and from my geographic location when I was growing up, that other people would be walking in the door with very different experiences. And at the time, I felt like I was already so underqualified in comparison to my peers. That is something that I felt carried through a lot of my undergrad. I often felt like I was underqualified because of the experiences that I had prior to going to university. When I got to my first year, something that was very typical to talk about your friends with was, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? A lot of people would say, my parents are doctors. My parents are lawyers. My parents work in banking. They would drive around campus with a car that their parents had bought for them. They were planning spring break trips that I would never be able to afford. And my particular background was that my dad was an electrician and my mom is disabled and wasn't able to work. And that wasn't something that I felt like I could really talk about with my peers when talking about, it would be nice to get together with our study group and go for dinner on Friday, but I have to work. Or I don't have the money at this time to really be engaged with that. Something that did really make the difference for me was I had one professor in particular who I was able to develop a relationship with and who came from a very similar background as me. And this was very pivotal in my academic journey because, again, being a first-generation student, there was a lot of pressure on me to take a certain path in my academics. My parents really wanted me to study science and be a doctor. It fit into their very kind of narrow view about what academia can lead to. And of course, they wanted that to end up in full-time work. While I was interested in pursuing an arts degree, which trying to convince my working class parents that an arts degree was a good investment of my time and money was not the easiest thing in the world to do. I'm going to be very honest. But I had a sociology prof who was from a working class background who was able to tell me, yes, I took this degree, but here are all the other things that I was able to do that helped enhance my CV, prepare me for grad school, prepare me for relevant work after the fact so that I was able to pay off my student loans. And kind of having someone there to answer those questions around, how do I make this meaningful was very, very important. Another aspect of my undergrad that I felt really came from being a first-generation student was the fact that academics weren't the only thing that was on my plate. And that often meant that it was a real balancing act between having to work full-time in order to pay my bills, trying to fit in extracurriculars because I couldn't afford to graduate from my degree and not have a job because I had student loans to pay off afterwards, as well as my academics. And I'm going to be very honest, my academics sometimes did not make the top of the pile, especially because, as mentioned, I worked in residence life. That meant that I was often working early into the morning, 3, 4 in the morning, while trying to run off to my volunteer work and do all these other things so that I could get hired afterwards. And it made it very hard sometimes to make it to an 8:15 class. The other thing about this that I found particularly related to my first generation status is while my peers were often comfortable expressing what they were going through to their professors, to the dean, I maybe wasn't so eager to acknowledge that I was having a hard time balancing things. I was expected to take on this much responsibility and more when I was home. And so admitting to myself, maybe I was taking on too much that I could chew, on top of having, everyone at home rooting for me, saying like, you can do this, sign up for 150 things. If that's going to make you a better candidate in the future, go for it. I didn't feel as comfortable asking for an extension on a paper. In fact, I often felt like I was a failure if I did. And so I will be honest, my academics definitely did suffer from all of these competing pressures during my undergraduate while really trying to stay afloat. And the last thing that I will highlight very quickly is again tied to this was finances. I genuinely had to fight to be at university at a financial standpoint. Part of why I decided to work in residence was because it was a guaranteed place to live. It meant I was likely paying it off throughout the year. But the good thing, the value of that to me, honestly, was that I could make chunks of payments when I could, because I couldn't guarantee that I would even be able to pay $400 in rent at the beginning of the month every year. When I moved off campus and I was working with the student union, and Tiffany and I were there at the same time, we were probably putting 40 to 60 hours in every week. I was making $320 biweekly. And my rent was $400. So it was very hard to balance all of this. It was an immense amount of stress. I didn't have the time per se on top of work and everything else to seek counseling or get financial help. I couldn't really ask at home about what their best methods about navigating this financial landscape was, because I know that they were struggling at home as well. In fact, even though I was making such little money, anytime I had extra money, I was sending it home. And I think this is really important to highlight because we often think for low-income students, first-generation students, the biggest barrier is getting in. Great. We're attracting students from all these socioeconomic backgrounds. They're in. Education's the great equalizer. I would suggest that the barriers only get harder once you actually are in that space and trying to navigate it. So I am very much looking forward to your comments, your questions, as well as what our other panelists are going to speak to. But those are really what I found to be the highlights during my undergraduate. So back to you, Tiffany.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Clancy. And I'm going to pass it over to Tanisha.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you, Clancy. I think a lot of my experiences echo some of yours. I'll focus more on after getting in rather than before. So for me, going into modern languages, just before actually starting classes, I had reached out to my professor in Japanese studies and expressed, my interest in being able to study over in Japan. And of course, there was a bit of back and forth, and eventually, professor, I guess he had his eye on me in terms of seeing how I would do throughout the term. And so I really pushed myself in terms of my academics, making sure that I really got good grades. And by the second term, he had approached me. He's like, okay, I think you have good potential. I'd like to send you to Japan. And I looked at him and I said, no. And he said, what? And I said, well, I would love to go, but I don't have the funding. So that was, I guess, the first hurdle. Of course, I was able to get in and being able to prove myself. But then when it came to the actual implications of the finances and whatnot, I fell short. And I was very fortunate in that situation because my professor, I guess, having maybe other students in similar situations, reached out to me and said, don't worry about the finances. There is a way around it. And so I jumped through the hoops. I made sure I filled in my application, went through the whole process. And when it came down to finalizing the final detail, I still felt very skeptic because if there was a way for me to be able to go to Japan and study and not have to worry about finances, I would imagine that I would have known before going in. And so it was very confusing and unsettling to think that I wouldn't have to worry, especially when you think of Japan, you think of pretty expensive place to go to, never mind live. And so when it came down to it, he said, don't worry, there are funds available for students to be able to study abroad. And I got those funds, and it was very surprising for me to see how easy it was in terms of being able to apply and getting the results thereafter, confirming that you will be able to afford this experience. And so for me, I just always wondered these boundaries, these sort of obstacles that us first generation students, when we look at these opportunities, being able to go in and make a better life for yourself, but then you think about the financial burden that comes with it, that tends to be sort of the stop for us in terms of whether or not we'd actually go forward or even trying. So I'm really grateful for my professor for really believing in me and seeing that, in spite of these financial burdens, that I had the potential of really being a great representation for Bishop's University abroad, especially as the first student to ever be sent to Tokushima University. I'm really, really grateful for his support. And even now, coming back to Bishop's after a time, I'm still getting a good amount of support from my professor. So it's very different from high school. It's very different from Cégep, being a Quebec resident. Coming into university and seeing people actually wanting you to succeed. It's a very different culture, and it's a bit of, if you will, a culture shock. And it's an adjustment, but it's also a little bit strange to think that it's okay to ask for help, because I've been so hardworking and having to do things myself, and can't really rely on a sort of safety net because I come from a lower socioeconomic status. And so it was a very interesting and enriching eye-opener. And so I really hope for other students, especially first-generation students who have these burdens, these hurdles to hop over, I hope that they have these opportunities, because it is really amazing. And I also, while I was in Japan, I also had the opportunity to host my own project, if you will, which was something that was very daunting and very scary for me, especially since I was alone. But my professor, again, was very supportive and insisted that I applied and that I did this and that it would be something great for me. I didn't see it in the moment, but looking back retrospectively, yes, it was amazing. And it was very important to have someone there to support me and to kind of give me a guideline in terms of, okay, this is what the previous students did. This is what you could do. Take your own spin on it. So I added a photographic exhibition to the cultural exchange project, and that was amazing. So yeah, that was my experience in the 1 year at Bishop's University that I like to share, and I'll pass it back to Tiffany.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Like I said, I'm acting as both panelist and moderator, so I thought I would touch on my opinions a little bit too. So I started in 2015. I'm from beautiful North Sydney, Cape Breton, which is a lovely place. You might hear otherwise, but it is very pretty. Great seafood chowder, if anyone's wondering. So I initially started high school in Memorial Composite High School, and I started in automotive mechanics, which if you're looking at me now, you're probably thinking, okay, what? But where I was from, what was normalized was going and doing trades and going to trade school and going directly into the workforce. So when it was actually one event that had happened in my life that kind of changed my path, which was the passing of my aunt Melanie. She had three lovely kids who are all younger than me, my nieces and my cousins, my mom's nieces and nephews, all younger than me. So there's one 2 years younger than me, and then two 4 years younger than me. And I decided that, you know, she was the person who would have been pushing them more to go into university. So if there needs to be someone who's being the leader in it, it should be me. So at that point, I dropped out of automotive mechanics. You know, it wouldn't have worked out anyways, but if you need your tires changed, your gal can do it. But I decided to start applying to different schools through a long, complicated story I'll bear you all the details of. I ended up at St. FX, and it was the shell shock of my life. So when I started at St. FX, my mother was working at a pizza shop. She made 29.5 grand that year. It cost me about 22.5 grand to be at school that year. So that's just to kind of put in context where I was at coming in and the financial support that I had moving forward. There was never a point in my university degree where I wasn't working 3 or more jobs, which is, you know, it was just normal at that point. When I started, I didn't very quickly find the support system that Clancy and Tanisha both mentioned. I struggled every day. I think my full first year, every single day I called my mom sobbing, being like, please take me out of the school. I don't want to be here. I don't want to do it. And every time it would be, well, you paid for this year, girl. Like, you're sticking it out now. You have no choice. So it was actually going into second year. I began working with residence life and also with the student union and started making some connections. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience kind of coming into these leadership roles, because I think Clancy and Tanisha touched really good on some of the academic experiences, but I wanted to touch a little bit too on, you know, we push students all the time to be getting involved with their student union, be getting involved in societies, and be getting involved in all these things. But I wanted to talk about that too from kind of a first generation student lens through my own experiences. So in 2018, I'm not quite sure. I ended up being a board member for Students Nova Scotia, which is now the organization that Clancy is the executive director of. We're coming full circle. But this was kind of one of my first big leadership roles. You know, I didn't really know what I was getting into by any means. You know, I came in late compared to everyone. So I came in right before this thing that happens that's called Advocacy Week. In Advocacy Week, the board goes and advocates to all different MLAs and in the area and different stakeholders. So I'm talking to the executive director at the time, not Clancy, and he's telling me what I need. And I need, you know, X amount of dress clothes and X amount of like a briefcase and all these things. I have nothing. Genuinely nothing. I've been wearing this. I haven't grown since grade 5, so I'm still wearing the same pair of jeans since I was in like grade 6, which is, it's fine. So I call my mother. I said, Mom, I have to give up this opportunity. I can't sit on the board. And she said, why? And I said, well, I need all these things. And like, I have $8 in my bank account. So sure enough, she talked me out of it. I ended up staying on the board. My $11 blazer from Target, I think it was Walmart actually, because I think Targets were gone at that point. I still wear it to almost every meeting I go into. So it's one of those things that, you know, my mom took money out of her rent that month for me to have the dress clothes to go participate in these things that we're trying to get students to go into every day. So that was just one of the challenges. It was a whole other wind whirl when I got onto the Board of Governors for the university. I'm going to tell you right now, I did not know what wealth is until I stepped into that room. For example, in my first meeting, we were talking about student accounts and letting students come back if they owe a little bit of money on their student account. And that was, I'll be frank with you all, an ugly discussion. There's always two narratives that happen, and that's absolutely okay, but it was very apparent that kind of the other end of, you know, supporting student success wasn't happening in the exact way that we wanted it to. So in this meeting, I had talked about kind of my experiences as a young Cape Breton student and what I've grown up with. And a man sitting across from me said, I'm from Cape Breton too, and I don't have these problems. So you're like, they don't exist. Uh, I'll tell you right now, there's a 360-degree tour of this person's house online that you could take. His son drove a Maserati. But we're here talking, and he's saying, no, like, none of your experiences are valid because I haven't experienced them. And that was really disheartening for me. I think I left that meeting and I was so upset. I think the first person I called was Clancy, actually, just being like, what did I do? Why am I here? But, I think it's just some of these things that we look at the institutional, how embedded this is, and trying to, we want students to do X and Y and Z to be able to move on in their lives and be the best students that they can. But we kind of we miss sometimes some of the struggles and challenges that our first generation students have. So I just wanted to bring that to light too, because I think that there's definitely some challenges that as moving forward we do need to address, and so I'm happy that we're all here talking about it. I did say at the half-hour mark we would be flipping over to more open discussion, but first I wanted to ask Clancy and Tanisha. If they had one or two things that could have happened in their university at a degree that would have made it a heck of a lot easier for them, what would it be? I'll pass you, Clancy, the floor.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for your sharing, both Tanisha and Tiffany. It's funny, so we did a little bit of a pre-call prior to this, and when Tanisha was telling her story and saying that there was funding available for international opportunities, I did not know that. And that really struck a chord in me that we need to get better at communicating what resources are available specifically to first-generation students. Now, I know and can empathize with the fact that communicating with students isn't always the easiest thing, especially if you're just sending it out to a general listserv and, we're all skimming our emails and we're reading something about parking here and something about the library there. I think we need to find a way to create a dedicated space and resource group for first-generation students and or low socioeconomic students, specifically to talk about resources on and off campus, but particularly financial. Because like you said, Tiffany, there were so many things that I would look at when I was an undergrad and say, wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't it be cool to go study in Paris for the semester? What a dream. I never took it seriously because I knew it was way out of reach for me financially, as well as the fact that I probably wouldn't be able to work and do all these other things once I was there. So for me, I think some form of resource sharing peer support group would be very valuable. And maybe next to Tanisha.
Thank you, Clancy. Yes, I definitely agree on those terms. I'm going to take a slightly different spin in terms of what I would like to see more in the academic context. Just a bit of background, oftentimes what I noticed is coming in from either high school or CEGEP, we tend to have this mentality of what do I need to learn in order to pass? And so I would love to see a bit more scaffolding, if you will, where faculty can kind of shape students' minds from a grades-oriented approach to university education to a more knowledge-oriented or applied knowledge-oriented approach. And so I feel that that would be good because by shifting our minds to think in this matter, I feel like it would invoke more creative thinking, and students may want to design projects, and that will just be more innately engaging. And so by creating these opportunities, I think it would be very rewarding for students and faculty. And so from a student perspective, it can be really intimidating. I can speak from my experience. But if you have continuous support, consistent support, and allowing students to have access to resources, especially the financial ones, I feel like we can overcome those obstacles in creating more of a welcome space for students. as opposed to just the sort of plug and chug of this is what it's worth and this is how much effort you need to put into it. It kind of makes it more of a real experience. So just going to keep that answer short so we have time for discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And, you know, I think Tanisha touched on something really important there is that, like I said, I came from automotive mechanics. I was in it for knowledge, leave, apply. And I definitely did approach university the exact same way. How do I set myself up, you know, to come out and actually get a job and actually make money? Definitely the mindset of so many students that we can definitely work on moving forward. I think for me, Clancy said it, my exact thoughts is, you know, being able to actually have targeted supports for first generation students. I think we do really good actually between the four Maple League universities at supporting so many different groups of students. And I do think first generation students kind of as a category does sometimes slip under the cracks. And the only thing that, you know, on kind of a fun enjoying looking at data standpoint, I would really love us to keep better metrics on which of our students are first generation so that we can actually have a better idea of how we, you know, recognize them and support them. So if there's any institutional analysis people here, identifying our first gen people, that is my dream. So moving into kind of a more open discussion, we've already received a question. They can go, if you don't want to ask them publicly, feel free to direct message them to Heather or myself, and I can facilitate them out to our group or toss them in the chat. So one of our first questions, and I'm going to preface this to the other two panelists, I did shoot it to them very quickly, was that how are we experiencing student debt? Could we touch on student debt and how it's impacted us as recent graduates, or how we feel it might impact us in our careers? So if anyone wants to start on that, I know it's a fun topic for the three of us. Clance.
Okay, so I love this topic for two reasons. One, because my professional life basically now revolves around student advocacy, and my favorite file is student financial assistance. But I am also a student who had to essentially take out as much loans as possible. So I'm going to answer it in two ways. One, on the personal front, I am very lucky. I know that I am very lucky where when I graduated, I walked into a full-time job, well, competed for a full-time job, and was lucky to secure that position. But it is going to be a challenge. I haven't actually entered repayment yet. I kind of got lucky with all of COVID-19 meant that both the provincial and federal loans were deferring payments until October. So I've actually yet to start back into my repayment. But when I look at the calculator and I stare down the fact that I'm going to be paying several $100s a month for the next 10 to 12 years, unless I'm in a position where, you know, I can make some lump sum payments to help with that, it's very difficult. And, you know, a lot of the research suggests, of course, that this disproportionately impacts students who take on additional debt from reaching other milestones in their life, such as pursuing a graduate degree or a professional degree, such as being able to save for a mortgage, such as being able to consider whether or not they're going to have children. These are real impacts. I don't know, you know, if/when I will ever be able to own a home, start a family, and I think that the debt I've taken on definitely plays into what my decision making will be in the future, and that is something that students who do not have to take out loans, do not have to think about. The flip side that I would say is positive is that with our current student loan programs, there is a genuine shift to switch to more of a grants-based system rather than a loan-based system. As a student advocate, I'm very lucky where I get to speak directly with student assistants from both our provincial side as well as our federal side. And the civil servants who work on that program know that the more upfront money in grants that we can provide to students, the better off they will be in the long run, because that debt can be crushing, and it does stop folks from continuing to participate in the economy after graduation. Some really positive developments that have happened recently. With COVID-19, a lot of the non-repayable funding has increased. In fact, the grants at the federal level have doubled. We are hoping, from an advocacy standpoint, to make the case, once we see how many students have benefited from this, that this is in fact the funding threshold we should be maintaining. Because we need to put this funds in folks' hands, and we also know that higher education is a social capital builder. So the more folks that we can actually get into these systems, how many first-generation students, low-income students, prevent themselves from pursuing higher education in the first place simply because they are debt adverse, and that comes from a good place, especially if your family is used to having to take on debt in order to pay for your groceries, your car payment, the basics. I think a lot of folks are trained that debt is bad. So if we can find a way to ensure that grants that are being provided outweigh the loans that are being provided, and then we can, sell this as an opportunity for students to invest in themselves. And I truly mean it, because the debt load will be skewed to the bottom end. I think that's the way to go in the future, and I'm happy to say that that's something I actually get to work on a daily basis. So yes, my current situation, I'm very lucky to be employed. If I were not employed, I would have to be taking advantage of repayment assistance plans. But I think that we are making a lot of positive steps in that regard.
Awesome. Thank you, Clancy. Tanisha, do you want to speak to that question, or would you like to move to the next one?
We can move to the next one just so that we can try and get through more questions.
Awesome. So the next question is, do any of our profs talk about having had this experiences in our classes, and is it helpful? Please correct me if I'm reading that question wrong. So do any of your professors talk about being a first generation student, what they went through, and is that helpful to us in our learning? Tanisha?
Well, my Japanese professor didn't really speak about being so much a first gen student. It was kind of clear as he would kind of recount his old stories, but that also kind of personalizes things, and having a smaller class size definitely helps. So in his situation, he would talk about how he kind of was an activist back in Japan, and so that was very interesting to see how he recounted his journey from Japan to the US to Canada. And in terms of speaking if he was a first gen in specific, no, he didn't really talk about it. If they had, maybe it would have been more helpful to see that we're not alone, right? It's not really something that you necessarily want to identify as straight up. No one wants to feel like the sort of poor kid on the block. But had more professors maybe been a bit more transparent about that quality, maybe more students would feel a bit more comfortable talking about their situation with their professors and facilitating being able to finish their degree once they start it.
Awesome. Thank you, Clancy. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think it really did make the difference for me when I was able to find out that my professors had working class backgrounds, and yet, they managed to pay for their school some way or another, managed to get full-time positions some way or another, because I feel like when you're in the midst of that grind, it can be very isolating, especially, as I said, if it seems like your peers are, having a great time down south, and you're working a 60-hour, you're looking forward to the break because it means you can actually have time to study. I think it is really helpful. So if folks are here and they're thinking, I have similar experiences, even just upfronting that and being a role model, I think can be incredibly helpful.
Awesome. Thank you. I would add to that as well. I don't think I've ever been in a class where a prof has kind of outwardly started a class by saying, like, I was a first generation student and, I experienced X, Y, Z. And I think there's a lot of reasons that people don't do that. But kind of as I went through I did meet more and more people who came from similar backgrounds to me, and that kind of had some pros and cons because on one end, it was great to be like, wow, you're successful. Like, there's hope for me. That's great. And on the other hand, they're also talking, now they're tenured profs, and they're just talking about, finally paying off their student loans. And so on the other end, it's very scary. So I think that's kind of the double-edged sword that you get with that one. But I also wanted to build onto that, and this wasn't a part of the question, but I think it's important to note is that the first university administrator that I met that openly talked about being a first generation student from a low income background was this year. And I have very strong relationships with a multitude of different administrators, and that is concerning to me. And the reason that I say it is because, these are the people who are making the decisions for our universities every day. They're the people who also get to lobby government and say, like, our students need XYZ support. They're the people who on the inside say, all right, as an institution, we need to adopt XYZ. And I think, we have a level of privilege that usually happens kind of in that upper hand that sometimes makes us forget about what happens down here. So I know, for example, and I didn't run by him that I was going to mention it. So I hope he doesn't get mad at me, but if he does, that's life. President Andy Haken, who just came in at St. FX, he'll be the first to tell you from his background and how he was a first generation student and how no part of him ever expected to be, the president of St. FX or the AVP of Lethbridge. He's, like I said, the first person who's ever outwardly said that from an admin point in my perspective. So, I think it's important to have these conversations at all levels, not just at a student level or not just at a faculty level, but every level in between as well. So moving on to the next question, what do you think would have been the best way to make the space feel open enough for you to feel comfortable saying something? So what would have helped to make the atmosphere, I guess, more comfortable for us to share our experiences more openly? I will pass it to Tanisha.
Yeah, that was very challenging for me. For instance, when opening up to my prof that I didn't have the money for Japan, although it kind of came up in a situation because he asked me to go. But if there was a way to kind of make it more comfortable, I do agree with something that Clancy had mentioned earlier in terms of making spaces either virtual or perhaps if once COVID passes. Perhaps clubs, first gen clubs, something where it's a space where you can kind of share your experiences, but not necessarily have to talk about it, but be around people who you won't really necessarily feel intimidated by. That it can be a challenge in itself, being able to access that, only because chances are as first gens we're working in those times that we would rather be relaxing or doing what other students who don't have financial burdens or such. And so just the space, for me, it helps to have a faculty member, someone as a mentor that you can kind of bond with. And that is very different coming in from CEGEP and university because the way we see faculty, it's like they have no time. There are too many students. They have their own projects. And so if we can kind of sort of permeate that barrier a little bit, let us see that, office hours aren't just for questions, but maybe just to, just have a quick chat with your professor about things that are interesting to you. That should be kind of the academic culture that is cultivated so that we can feel that, this is university. This is kind of what the work life will be. You're not just there when you get your job, you're not just there doing your work. You're bonding with your coworkers, you're bonding with your boss. It should really kind of echo what you're going to be seeing later on. It won't be exactly the same, but that would help.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Clancy, do you want to touch on that question?
Sure. So I think the real value of the Maple League, and one of the big sells of all of our institutions, is that class size is usually small enough where professors know your name. Professors know who you are. You're more than a student number. That being said, I always found that it was very dependent on the tone that was set by the instructor at the beginning of the class, the beginning of the term, as to whether or not, okay, do I really feel comfortable coming forward and saying, like, hey, can I have the weekend to work on this? I just worked a double shift. So I think empathy is very important. Even building that into your syllabus, building it into the initial talk that you give and saying, if you're facing extenuating circumstances, if you're trying to pull an all-nighter while working a 40-hour week, come talk to me. It's not the end of the world to have to get an extension on this or be able to work through. Having flexibility around scheduling, I think, is very important. And once students know that door is open, I feel like they are more likely to come forward and be honest about their experiences. I think that's a lot. I think that's a lot easier than perhaps asking students to just self-identify because, as we've mentioned, it really isn't fun when all of your peers seem to come from these, highfalutin backgrounds and you grew up on a dirt road. Like it's isolating in itself. But really driving that message home and driving it home often, I think is important because part of the reason as well that I was always anxious about going to certain professors was I was afraid, are they going to think I'm lazy? Are they going to think that I got caught off guard and now the paper's due in a week and there's nothing I can do about it? Because I did have some peers who found themselves in those situations sometimes. And the other thing is that if a student comes, they might not fully disclose what's going on. They might kind of say, I'm looking for an extension, or I need a little help with this, or I'd like some advice. So I think being open to that and also checking our own biases around why a student might be coming forward for help. Sure, I'm sure you always have students who come towards the end of the semester and kind of like, I need a little help. Let's not jump to the conclusion that it's because folks are, not doing their work. It might just be that they have 15 balls in the air right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So our next question, are there ways in which your working class backgrounds made you stronger and more equipped in universities in ways that might not be obvious? So one of the things that come to my mind right away is that hard work wasn't a problem. In high school, I started working full time when I was 16 to help my mom pay her bills. So coming into kind of, I guess, the rigor of university wasn't as much of a transition as what I had actually anticipated, which was, I didn't realize that till a lot later on in my experiences, but I had friends, who haven't had to lift a finger once in their life, very genuinely, who really, really struggled once they got to university because they just did not know how to keep up with the pace. So I think for me, that was probably one of the things from my working class background that made me a little more equipped. And then the other thing that I would say is being able to manage money. I say that with, a tone of hesitation because I'm up to my eyeballs in student debt. Don't get me wrong. I'm 100% in my eyeballs in student debt. But, I was able to kind of make more rational choices about, is this a useful expense in my university degree? Is this worth it? Is this not worth it? And I don't know if I would have had that otherwise. So I invite Tanisha or Clancy if you'd like to speak on that question.
Sure, I can jump ahead. So I saw a quote recently, and it said, and I'm going to read it verbatim. Some of us are building from scratch, no inheritance, no connections, no backups, just blood, sweat, and skills. And I think that very much summarizes how I felt. And it's also really helped me acknowledge and appreciate that quality in other people. Because one thing that I did find is that a lot of the spaces that I came into, particularly residence life being, a lot of hours, kind of thankless work, not necessarily a lot of money, but a very stable job. I found that's where I found the most low income or first generation students. And they were the hardest working people that I met in my whole time at university. I think it was beneficial, as Tiffany said, to know what hard work looked like, to be able to say no on a Friday or a Saturday and not exactly have FOMO because you were used to that. Um, for me, it wasn't necessarily that I was good at money. It was that I didn't have a backup if I spent it. So if I spent too much money and couldn't pay my rent, there was no one else there to pay it for me. So it kind of forces you into that routine. But I think it has served me incredibly well. I think without having to be so disciplined throughout my entire 4 years, I wouldn't be where I am at. I think it gives me a very unique perspective, particularly academics wise. I was a sociology major, so it was very funny to talk about class analysis when I was the only person who belonged to a lower socioeconomic status in the class. And something that I would also say as a very positive, I loved being able to take my learning home and being able to, that, here I was paying $80,000 for my degree. And I think a common misconception is that, if you didn't go to university, you're not smart. My parents are the most brilliant people I know. Quite honestly, I have met cabinet ministers, I've met administrators. My parents are the smartest people I know. And being able to talk through global politics and class analysis and theory with them is the greatest gift I've ever gotten to have. And to be able to pay that forward to them, knowing how hard they had to work in order to help me get to where I was, I think was definitely one of the biggest positives.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Clancy. And, I echo something you just said. I think my mom could teach quantum mechanics at this point, mostly just from listening to me talk about whatever I was trying to learn, which I still can't actually explain to you. So we're going to take this last question, and then I'm going to flick it over to Tanisha for a few minutes. But Tanisha, I'm going to give you a forewarning that this might fall into this question. So this question, I'm going to try to paraphrase it, and I extend the invite to the person to really correct me if I'm totally off base with what they're asking. How do we educate and develop and provide development opportunities for professors and other faculty to be flexible and accepting things not just as letter grades? So how do we kind of redesign the system for a more empathetic approach beyond just report cards and GPAs? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one? It's a tough one.
It definitely is a tough one. In terms of the how, it's very multifaceted because then you need to have an understanding of what the systems are, how they currently work, and maybe even taking an example rather than reinventing the wheel on how it could work, what is working, and then just kind of like integrating those systems in a way that would work for your students. And so it's a challenge. It's going to be a challenge, and I feel like as a first step is really just getting the ideas or the opinions from the students, hearing your students, and then working your way up, hearing the students, hearing the faculty, and eventually bringing all of those voices to the decision and policymakers. So the actual how and the step-by-step process I'm not familiar with, and so I don't have an exact answer. However, I feel like these conversations that we're having and these discussions that we're hosting are really important. They're integral in being able to kind of get the ball rolling. And so it's going to be a work in progress. There is no one answer fits all, but I do hope that within the Maple League we can kind of come to an idea, an answer, a system that can work for our students, especially during COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Clancy, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to mention, I always found it difficult to manage a grading scheme that seemed very all or nothing. So you get one paper and one exam and you're done. Well, if something came up, during that period in which I had to work on either or, and you didn't have other opportunities to make up that grade or show the dedication that you had for the course, I found that's where I tended to struggle a little bit more. So I think providing many opportunities for students to show their strengths so that if circumstantially things come up, they're still able to kind of rest on the fact that it could be circumstantial. And if students do come forward and say, I'm having a hard time with this, being open to finding alternatives or extra credit, I think is important because especially if students come forward. I know I had approached professors sometimes. Tiffany talked about Advocacy Week. When I was a vice president at the student union, I had to take 2 full weeks off of school, and I was in lobby meetings with top decision makers talking about these issues, talking about equity for students 12 hours a day for a week. I wasn't getting schoolwork done. And so I would often come with a proposal and say, hi, I apologize I wasn't in class the last 2 weeks. Here is a paper I'm planning to write on the paper topics. Would you be interested in that? Sometimes you got mixed messages. So I think just being open to perhaps the ideas that your students might come up with in order to demonstrate their learning is important.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Tanisha, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, so I had actually created a little infographic. I may not be able to go too much in detail as time may not permit, but I'll quickly share the infographic that I created and also provide a quick link to the actual document if ever you guys want it. So really just looking at our first generation students and essentially everything that we talked about today, you can find them on the right side. Social capital, being able to have a great academic acumen in terms of what do you do once you're admitted? What do you do? Who do you connect with? Resources, as we mentioned, having the resources, the finances, and the time to be able to really just focus on your academia. That is a struggle that a lot of us first generation students have to contend with. And of course, it's case by case. Some people are coming in. We're all coming in from different walks of life. And so the access to those resources, the social support, financial support, and of course, oftentimes we're coming in with a very independent mindset. And so collaborating or even just opening up about our stories to other people, it's not very comfortable most of the times. And so it is important to kind of create those safe spaces, being able to bond or tell our story to someone who can kind of mentor or guide us through our academic journey is pretty important. And so, of course, the needs of having that sense of belonging, I think, is pretty integral in being able to share our stories and those people being able to guide or scaffold our learning. And of course, creating a vision. What do we want to do with this? Of course, we want to create a better life for ourselves, but what do we actually want to be able to do, bring for ourselves? What is fulfilling? And so that is something I feel is important to look at for especially first generation students. The benefits that come out of it, I have mentioned before, can be very intrinsically motivating for the professors, for the faculty, for the students, engagement, and of course, with all of these qualities, we can eventually lead to graduation, whether they go on to a profession or graduate studies. And so how to help, I really do like what Clancy brought up in terms of approachability. I will add consistency, having those spaces available to us on a consistent basis, and being equity-minded. So that was quickly just the little infographic that I created, and I will end it there, and that's available to everyone there. I put the link in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tanisha. And we are at the hour exactly, but I did just receive one more question, and I do think it's important. So maybe I'm going to invite this person actually to message the three of us afterwards. What challenges are first generation students in particular going to face in fall 2020 in light of COVID-19? And, off the top of my head, I'll keep it really brief. We depend on having jobs in the summer. The majority of students work in hospitality or tourism or retail. None of those things happen this summer. We depend on having jobs on campus. A lot of the jobs won't happen because a lot of the events on campuses aren't happening. While there's increased student aid, which, I do think is really great, we do have still so many problems that come that are going to come just out of the fact that we don't have the same opportunities that we normally would. So I'm going to leave it there just because people have places to be. I invite that person to reach out to us directly. We'll be more than happy. I invite anyone who wants the answer to that question from our experiences to reach out. And thank you so much for joining us today. This is a really important topic, especially to first generation students who, were the ones who experienced the struggles of it. So the fact that you could all join us today and work towards a more inclusive education is really great. It's really great for you all to be here. So thank you very much.